On Monday, the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States went on television and asked the Federal Reserve to make an emergency lending window bigger. The window lends dollars to foreign governments. It is capped at $60 billion. And the country every single person watching assumed he was talking about is sitting on $1.14 trillion of American debt. 60 billion against 1.14 trillion. That backstop covers about 5% of what one country is holding. I read the Federal Reserve's own published FAQ for this facility, the actual document, not the coverage of it. And there are two things in there that nobody is putting on television. The first, the Fed compares this window, in its own words, to the discount window. That's the emergency counter they opened for banks in 2008. Their comparison, not mine. The second one is the one to hold on to. The Fed publishes how much gets borrowed from this window every single week in a public report. What it publishes is a number. Before this video is over, I'm going to show you exactly what that weekly number leaves out, and why, the last time they ran a window like this, it took a 2-year lawsuit before anybody in this country found out. I caught this Monday morning because a number I watch crossed a line I'd set, and my screen told me before the news did. I'll come back to that. Let's walk it in order because the order is the whole story. Start with the yen. Japan's currency has been falling for months, down at levels it hasn't seen in 40 years. And a currency losing value like that isn't an abstraction to the people who live there. It's the grocery bill. It's the imported energy bill. It's a nation's savings leaking out of the bottom of the bucket. So Japan did what a country does when it has had enough. It stepped into the market and started buying its own currency. Bank of Japan figures suggest they may have spent as much as $59 billion doing it. Now here's the part that made the professionals sit up. The United States joined in. Not with advice, with money. The American Treasury stepped into a foreign currency market and bought yen alongside Tokyo. The first joint intervention between these two countries in 15 years. And then Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, said this out loud. The United States will not hesitate to participate in further joint intervention. Japan's finance ministry said almost exactly the same sentence. Two governments on the record promising more. So the obvious question, and almost nobody in the coverage is asking it, is why does America care what the yen is worth? Stay with me because the answer is sitting in your mortgage payment. Here's the chain. 4 links. Follow them and you'll understand this better than most of the people talking about it. Link 1. When a country defends its currency, it needs dollars to spend. Buying yen means selling something else to get the dollars. Link 2. What does Japan own that it could sell? It owns $1.14 trillion of United States Treasury bonds. Japan is the largest foreign holder of American government debt on the planet. Not China, Japan. Link 3. So a serious, sustained yen defense means Japan reaching into the drawer and selling American bonds. Selling in size. Link 4. And this is where it stops being a foreign story. When somebody dumps a mountain of treasury bonds onto the market, the price of those bonds falls. And when the price of a bond falls, the interest rate it pays goes up. That's not opinion, that's arithmetic. It's the seesaw those two things have always sat on. Higher treasury rates mean a higher 30-year mortgage, a more expensive car loan, a bigger interest bill on the $38 trillion this government already owes, which comes out of the same pot your Social Security check comes out of. So read the chain backwards and you get the real headline. If Japan has to sell, your mortgage rate goes up. And I don't want that to stay abstract, so let's put a number on it. Take a $400,000 mortgage, 30-year fixed. At 6.5%, the payment is about $2,528 a month. Move that rate up one single point to 7.5, and the payment becomes about $2,797. That's $269 a month for the same house. Over the life of the loan, it's roughly $96,000. 1 point. Now run the same 1 point across the 38 trillion this government owes, and you're looking at something on the order of $380 billion a year in additional interest forever on debt nobody is paying down. That is what's on the other side of Japan reaching into that drawer. Which is why somebody in Washington would very much like Japan to have another option. There's a second reason Washington is nervous, and it's the one that connects Tokyo to your brokerage statement. For 20 plus years, Japan has kept interest rates at essentially zero, which means Japan has been the cheapest place on earth to borrow money. So the largest funds in the world have done the obvious thing: borrow yen for almost nothing, convert it to dollars, and buy something that actually pays: American stocks, American bonds, American everything. Borrow at zero, earn 5, keep the difference. It has a boring name, which is exactly why nobody asks about it. It's called the carry trade, and the boring name is the disguise. Here's the thing about that trade: it only works while the yen stays weak, because you borrowed in yen, and one day you have to pay it back in yen. If the yen keeps sinking, you repay with cheaper money and you pocket the gap. But the moment the yen gets stronger, your loan silently gets bigger. The thing you owe is now worth more than the thing you borrowed. And when a leveraged position moves against you, you don't get a stern letter. You get a phone call telling you to put up more money right now. To do that, you sell whatever you can sell fastest. And what sells fastest is American stocks. So sit with the shape of that. An intervention designed to strengthen the yen is, mechanically, an intervention that makes the world's largest borrowed trade more expensive, all at once, for everybody in it. They are trying to steer a currency without knocking over a leverage pile they did not build and cannot measure. And your savings are sitting underneath it. That option has a name, and it is one of the least discussed instruments in American finance. It's called the FEMA Repo Facility, Foreign and International Monetary Authorities. Here's how it works in kitchen table English. A foreign central bank walks up to the Federal Reserve. It hands over its United States Treasury bonds. It walks out with dollars, and it agrees to come back later, return the dollars, and collect its bonds. That's a pawn shop. That is precisely, mechanically, a pawn shop for governments. You bring in the thing you own, you leave with cash, and you keep the ticket. I explained this to my wife as a pawn shop for governments. She asked what happens if they don't come back for their stuff. I said that's the part nobody wants to talk about. She said, so it's exactly like a pawn shop. And notice what the pawn shop accomplishes. Japan gets its dollars without selling a single bond. The bonds never touch the open market. The price never drops. Your mortgage rate never moves. The pressure that should have shown up in public, in a price where you could see it, gets absorbed privately behind a counter. The facility was created in March of 2020. It was made permanent in 2021. It charges 0.25 percentage point above what the Fed pays banks on their reserves. And here is the thing about it that matters most: it has barely ever been used. The only real drawdown of note came during the Silicon Valley Bank Week in 2023. It is a fire exit that has almost never been opened. And on Monday, the Treasury Secretary asked to make it wider. His exact words on CNBC: the size of the bond market was much smaller then, so I think it would be reasonable for the Fed to consider upsizing the facility. Read that again slowly. The bond market has outgrown the emergency exit. So let's widen the exit. Not let's shrink the fire. Widen the exit. A $60 billion backstop against a $1.14 trillion position. That's a bucket under Niagara Falls, and somebody just asked for a bigger bucket. Now, the question this whole story turns on, and the one I want you to sit with: where do the dollars come from? When Japan pawns those bonds and walks out with dollars, those dollars are not taken from a vault of pre-existing money. They are not raised in taxes. They are not borrowed from savers. The Federal Reserve creates them, on the spot, against the collateral. So follow what that actually means. American government debt, the debt you and your children are on the hook to service, becomes the collateral for the creation of brand new dollars handed to a foreign government. And every one of those new dollars is a slice of the purchasing power sitting in your bank account. Not seized, not taxed, diluted. The number in your account does not change. What it buys does. That's the trade being made on your behalf this week, and nobody asked you. Your savings get quietly finned so that a foreign government doesn't have to sell the bonds that would have raised your mortgage rate. Both roads cost you. One of them you'd have seen on the evening news. The other one just shows up at the grocery store 18 months from now, and nobody can tell you why. That is what a currency crisis looks like when it's managed well. It doesn't look like a crisis at all. It looks like a quiet Monday. That 30-year mortgage number I mentioned, I don't check it by hand anymore. My macro command center at timtalksfinance.com/members emails me the moment it crosses the line I set. And I want to be fair here, because credibility is the only thing this channel actually sells. Serious people think this is a reasonable idea. A stable yen genuinely does matter to the region. A disorderly unwind genuinely would be worse. This isn't a conspiracy, it's a policy choice, made in public, by people who believe they're preventing something worse. But Evercore ISI, a Wall Street research shop, not a Goldbug newsletter, warned this week that focusing on a capped facility could backfire by inviting markets to test the commitment of the US and Japan if defending the yen requires large sales of US Treasuries. That's the exact domino I just walked you through, published by people who do this for a living. And a strategist at Monetary Policy Analytics read Besant's move in one line. He's coming out and saying the US basically has infinite firepower to back this trade up. Infinite firepower. Hold that phrase. Because there is exactly one asset in this entire story where that sentence cannot be said, and we're walking toward it. I promised you the buried thing, and here it is. The Federal Reserve does publish this. Every week, in a report called the H.4.1, it prints how much is outstanding under that facility. Open it up and you will see a dollar amount. What you will not see is a name. The report tells you that somebody borrowed. It does not tell you who. You will know the size of the loan and never the borrower. And there is no line on that page where the answer lives. Now, why does that specific gap matter? Because we have run this exact experiment before, and we know how it ends. In 2008, the Federal Reserve ran an emergency counter for banks, the discount window. A firm with a liquidity problem could walk up, borrow what it needed, and the public was not told who had walked up. The reasoning at the time was that naming names would spark a panic, and that reasoning wasn't crazy. And there's a detail inside that which tells you everything about how these windows really work. Banks in 2008 didn't want to be seen using the discount window, because if the market found out you needed emergency money, that alone could finish you. Bankers had a word for it. They called it stigma. So the secrecy wasn't a bug the Fed tolerated, the secrecy was the product. The window only functioned because nobody could see who walked through it. Bloomberg News asked who borrowed. The Fed said no. So Bloomberg sued under the Freedom of Information Act. And it took years and a federal court order before, in March of 2011, the American public finally learned which institutions had been at that window during the crisis. Years. To find out who had borrowed our money from our central bank against our credit. And by the time we found out, every decision that information might have changed had already been made. I told my daughter it took a 2-year lawsuit to pry those names loose. She asked why they didn't just call and ask. I said they did. She said, and? I said they got a letter back that was mostly black ink. So here's where we actually stand. The same institution, running the same kind of window, on the same public interest logic, except this time the counter is not open to banks on Wall Street. It is open to foreign governments. and the weekly report will faithfully tell you the number. The Fed's own FAQ, in its own words, says the collateral at this window is margined similar to collateral posted to the Federal Reserve's discount window. They drew that comparison themselves. I just read it out loud. Now let me put one more thing beside that weekly report, because the contrast is the sharpest thing in this entire story. The Federal Reserve will tell you the amount and withhold the name, and it will do that lawfully, deliberately, and with a defensible reason. Bitcoin cannot do that. Not won't, cannot. Every Bitcoin transaction that has ever happened is written into a public ledger that anyone on Earth can download tonight for free on a laptop without asking anyone's permission. Every coin that has ever been created, all of them, since 2009, is auditable by you personally. You do not file a request. You do not sue anybody. You do not wait 2 years for a court order and get back a page of black ink. And here's the part that should stop you cold. There is no Bitcoin equivalent of that weekly report, because there is nothing to report. No new Bitcoin can be conjured against collateral, so there's no emergency lending number to publish, no borrower to protect, and no name to withhold. The report doesn't exist because the facility doesn't exist. One system's stability depends on you not knowing who borrowed. The other one works precisely because everyone knows everything, all the time. That is not a small difference in transparency policy. That's two completely different theories of how money should work. And this week, one of them needed a bigger window, while the other one didn't need anything at all. Step back and look at what this week actually exposed, because it's bigger than Japan. The yen was in trouble, so it got a lender, 2 governments, and a checkbook. The Treasury bond was in trouble because somebody might have to sell it, so it got a lender, a window at the Fed. The dollar covers all of it, because the dollar has a printer, and the printer has no cap that a phone call can't change. Every single asset in that chain has somebody standing behind it who can conjure more of it. That's not a scandal, that's the design. That is what these instruments are for. And now look at what they're building next. They are tokenizing the world. Stocks, bonds, credit, real estate, the deed to your house, moving every asset you own onto digital rails. And every one of those wrappers inherits the same thing. The token has an issuer. The fund has a custodian. The stablecoin has a company that can freeze it on a Tuesday. The bond has a treasury. The dollar has a printer. Every exit they are building for you has a landlord standing in the doorway. Which leaves exactly one question worth asking, and it's the question this channel has been circling for 2 years. Which asset has no issuer? There is one. There's exactly one, and this week put it in unusually sharp relief. Bitcoin has no lender of last resort. There is no window Bitcoin can walk up to. There is no facility with a cap that somebody can go on television and ask to raise. Nobody can pledge Bitcoin as collateral to a central bank and have new Bitcoin created against it, because there is no institution anywhere on Earth with the authority to create Bitcoin. Not the Fed, not the Treasury, not the Bank of Japan, not the people who wrote it. 21 million. Fixed. Forever. No servers, only a protocol. And I want to be precise here, because this is the place people get it exactly backwards. The fact that Bitcoin has no lender of last resort is almost always filed under weakness. Nobody to bail it out. Nobody to catch it when it falls. And in a panic that is completely real, when Bitcoin drops 40%, nobody is coming. There is no emergency meeting. There is no facility to upsize. You are on your own. Now hold that next to what you watched this week. Japan has a lender of last resort. Japan has several. And that is precisely why Japan is in this position. Because for 30 years, the debt could always be rescued, so it was allowed to grow until only a rescue could hold it up. The rescue didn't arrive because the problem got big. The problem got big because the rescue was always going to arrive. A lender of last resort is not a safety net stretched under the system. It is the reason the system is standing up this high in the first place. which means the asset with nobody behind it is the only asset that never had to be propped up to begin with. Bitcoin doesn't need a window because Bitcoin never borrowed anything. Nobody ever printed extra Bitcoin to paper over a bad decade. So there is no accumulated debt to defend, no currency to prop, no counterparty to rescue at 2 in the morning. I told my buddy Bitcoin has no lender of last resort. He said that sounds like a design flaw. I said, so does a house with no fire exit, right up until you notice the house isn't on fire. And here's how it lands on your kitchen table. Every dollar created at that window gets divided into the same pool your savings are sitting in. Your account balance doesn't move. What it buys does. That is the entire mechanism, and it has run for 100 years. Bitcoin's supply schedule did not change this week. It will not change next week. There is no meeting on any calendar anywhere on Earth where 12 people can vote to change it. Not when the yen falls, not when a Treasury Secretary goes on television, not when the next crisis arrives with a name we haven't heard yet. The number of Bitcoin that will ever exist was fixed before any of these men held their jobs, and it will be the same number after they leave. That is the whole argument. That's the entire channel in one sentence. In a week where every single asset in the chain revealed the man standing behind it, Bitcoin is the one that had nobody to reveal. So what do you actually do with this? I'm not going to tell you to run out and buy anything. There are no certainties here, only probabilities. But this week handed you a few of them cheap. The probability that this window gets used, now that the Treasury Secretary has publicly pointed at it, higher than it was last Friday. The probability that it gets upsized, given he asked on camera, higher again. The probability that a government facing a currency crisis chooses the option that keeps the pain off the front page. I'd say that one is close to certain, because that's what every government has always chosen. And the probability that you'll be told, in real time, exactly who borrowed and how much? You already know that answer. You watched them fight it for 2 years last time. So the question isn't whether to trust these people. Most of them are competent, and many of them are right. The question is simpler and colder than that. Do you want every asset you own to depend on somebody being competent forever? Because that's the actual choice. Not Bitcoin versus the dollar. Nobody's asking you to close your bank account. It's a world where every exit has a landlord versus owning one thing that doesn't. And notice, I'm not telling you Bitcoin goes up this month. I have no idea what Bitcoin does this month, and anybody who tells you they do is selling something. Bitcoin can fall 30% while every word in this video stays true, because none of this was ever an argument about price. It's an argument about who has the authority to make more. For the dollar, the answer is a committee. For a treasury bond, the answer is a Congress. For Bitcoin, the answer is nobody. And that answer does not change with the yen, the Fed chair, or the decade. You don't have to bet the farm on that. Most people I respect who hold Bitcoin hold a slice, sleep fine, and let the arithmetic do the work over 10 years instead of 10 weeks. Hand yourself the math and walk through the door on your own schedule. Free, no credit card, 2 minutes. Go to timtalksfinance.com/members. You'll get the same live numbers I watch, the 10-year, the 30-year mortgage, gold, Bitcoin, all on one screen, plus a 2-minute quiz that shows you in actual dollars what inflation is quietly costing your savings every year. Full package members set the price alerts I mentioned at the top. The free account gets you the screen. I built it so you don't have to figure this out alone. $60 billion against 1.14 trillion. A window nobody's supposed to need, that a Treasury Secretary just asked to make wider. And a weekly report that will tell you the number and never the name. Wherever the truth lands, and this week it landed at a pawn counter in Washington, it keeps landing on Bitcoin. I'll see you in the next one.